The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Voices in Validation. We are thrilled to have you here with us today as we welcome our guest, Roberta Goode, principal at Alltrek LLC. Today, we are thrilled to have Roberta here to discuss with us the process and procedures necessary to launch medical device products in this three-part series. Get your medical device to market in 10 easy steps. Over the next 3 weeks, we will talk with her about each step brought to you in phases so that it is understandable, manageable, and replicable. Welcome, Roberta.
Thank you, Stacey. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Oh, it is my pleasure. 100% my pleasure. I appreciate you coming and agreeing to do a three-part series because this is a big topic, but one that I think our listeners will be really excited to tune into. So this week, we're going to start with the first in the three-part series, which is all around the planning of medical device, getting your medical device to market. So developing a medical device product requires extensive financial resources as well as an investment of time and talent. And the investment may well be worth the gain as it may open new markets, expand reach within existing portfolios, as well as provide much needed healthcare solutions to the consumer. So in this three-part series, we will take you from concept to customer, outlining the life cycle in 10 manageable steps. And as I mentioned, we are going to focus on the planning portion for this particular episode. Roberta, could you please outline the steps we'll be covering in part one for our listeners?
Sure, Stacey, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
Sure. As Stacey said, part one that we'll discuss this week is all about the planning for the commercialization and product development process. And so specifically in the planning phase, we've got three separate sub-items. The first is the assessment of commercial feasibility of the product. And that has within it four separate additional items. So again, assessing commercial feasibility, the first step has market evaluation, determining the regulatory path, considering intellectual property, and fourth and finally, looking at the quality system requirements that will apply. So those four items are all part of assessing commercial feasibility. The other parts we'll cover this week will include demonstration of technical feasibility, so as opposed to commercial feasibility. And then finally, how to go about building our business case so that we have the best chance of getting the funding that we'll need to move forward.
Excellent. That totally makes sense. And I noted that you mentioned feasibility a couple of times in your opening there. So with that in mind, a feasibility study I know is needed to determine if a particular idea has legs. How can we ensure, Roberta, that we're building a product that meets an unmet clinical need and not just a product idea that may seem like a good fit for a market or that we maybe think we could force into a particular market?
Wow. Stacey, that is the best question. I can't tell you. I love this question. I can't tell you how often I see my colleagues, engineers, design engineers, biomedical engineers in this industry share excitedly the news that they've thought of a great idea. Oh, I have this great idea, they'll say, and we all collaborate in confidence. This great idea, and here's how it can be used, and here's how I'm going to build it. And, and then one of us will ask the other, well, who needs that? Is that something that surgeons are currently asking for, or will it address a patient risk issue? And more often than not, I'm afraid the answer is sort of a dour, no, I don't know, I haven't checked yet. So what I tell my students and what I try to do myself when I was designing and patenting medical devices is simply this. Instead of coming up with a great idea and then looking for a hole that you can shove that peg into, why not develop relationships first with surgeons, with interventionalists, with other healthcare providers who day to day, they're on the front line, Stacey, right? And they know better than anyone what the gaps are, what's missing, what would really help. So I made friends with some interventional cardiologists, for example, in that realm, and asked if I could just pick their brain about what the unmet needs are or were in interventional cardiology. Likewise, maybe spending some time in a cath lab or an operating room in any of the clinical applications. Once you stand shoulder to shoulder with the surgeon or physician or the healthcare provider, I think it also allows us as creative designers to have an insight not only into the ideas that the physician has, but also into the larger environment in which they'll be used, which adds a lot of insight, again, as I say, when we're looking at designing for human factors and usability and with patient risk reduction in mind. So then, the advantage of doing this is that you're already able to then solve a problem, fill an unmet need. The market, the market is there. Right. And you may develop a product champion in the process, as this physician or surgeon will then tell two friends, and there you have it, a ready-made product champion for marketing.
Absolutely. And I can imagine, I know we'll talk about this later, but I can imagine that just makes it that much more appealing to funders, right? And right. And other people who you need in your corner as you begin to develop a product such as this. So I love that. I mean, that makes so much sense to me, that it really comes from real world experience, if you will, or real world needs.
Exactly.
So thank you for that. And part of developing the product launch plan, in addition to the feasibility study, should also include defining the regulatory strategies required by the markets to which you plan to release your initial product. And we know that the world is so vast, but yet so small, and not every product is going to be launched here in the United States first. Sometimes you may be considering a launch in the European Union or other markets for that matter. So what key considerations in your experience are needed in developing strategy for product introduction in the EU, for example?
Well, again, another great question. This is something that is in flux right now. What a timely point for you to bring up, Stacey. Not too long ago, there's what we call in the field a convergence of regulatory standards and requirements, particularly in the European Union, although they'll have much broader impact and are already being adopted and used throughout the world, including in the United States. But these changes, this convergence of revised standards, which are essentially brought about based on a patient safety concern, again, in the European Union, having to do with an unfortunate story wherein several patients were harmed because of a loss of supplier controls by a medical device manufacturer of an implantable device. And so this really got the attention of the European Commission, and we saw, as a result of that, the Medical Device Directive, which up to that time guided the regulatory requirements for product release or medical device import into the European Union, was modified. It is now known as the Medical Device Regulation. That simple change from directive to regulation means that it has legal legs. It's enforceable by law. And the additional emphasis, among other things, that the specific emphasis rather was on patient safety. So we also saw the ISO 14385 quality management system revised to align with the medical device regulation and emphasizing patient safety. And furthermore, the ISO 14971 risk management standard was revised. So the three of these are I don't want to say harmonized. Let's just say that there's a convergence. Harmonized has a special meaning, so I won't use that term now. So it used to be that the European Union was, if you will, a softer landing place to start initial product launch, in the sense that there were fewer regulations. There was more of a collaborative business environment with the EU with regard to medical device manufacturers in the US. But with the convergence and revision of these three standards, we're actually finding a sea change where the European Union may be the most stringent requirements of all. And so it's looking more and more like we won't start product launch in the EU. We'll probably start them in the US. Used to be one of the most difficult places to start, but now in comparison may in fact be easier. But I would say this though, in general, knowing where the product launch is going to be is an essential part of planning for any type of medical device product development. Let me give an example quickly, if I may. For example, in Japan, if you know that, thank you. If you know that in Japan, let's say that we're not sure that we're going to provide our product to Japan yet, but it's on the horizon as a potential. We know we want the universe to include the United States and the European Union with the possibility of the Asia Pacific Rim region, specifically Japan, to start. Well, did you know how many product design engineers have been thwarted by this simple detail that in Japan, when you perform shelf life testing for product labeling, you must add 30 days to the test cycle in order to label the expiry date. So if you didn't know that, you'd go into these studies, which are very long and costly, and then find that you can't release in Japan for lack of 30 days of testing after years of testing. So I would suggest that your listeners look at the regulatory and technical requirements for each region that they even consider going into. Doing it at the beginning of the development process is much less costly than finding out at the end that you have to repeat studies.
Wow, I had no idea, that there was that big a difference from country to country or region to region. So that is certainly valuable information for our listeners. And on that same note, so we just talked about the European Union, and it sounds like they have really upped their game in terms of the regulation and guidances. How might our product launch differ, or our product launch plan, differ here if you're planning your initial launch here in the United States? And why it's so important to identify applicable regulatory product codes and product classifications with the US FDA, who we know is the main regulatory agency here in the United States?
Well, a couple of key points there that your question touches on. So the first point I'd like to make is with regard to the second part of your question, Stacey. You asked about product codes and product classification within the US FDA. So one of the main reasons why this is essential for us to understand upfront in our product development process is because one of the biggest issues that we have to overcome, especially if we are looking at a startup company in medical device manufacturing and design, and we have to look for our own funding.
Right.
and regardless, all sizes of companies, of course, are looking for, helping patients while building their profitability. So in all cases, it will be important to notice the importance of product codes and product classifications is that, first of all, it's aligned with the risk. So FDA provides a classification of products from 1 to 2 to 3, with 3 being the most serious in the sense that if there is to be a product failure of any kind, patient harm is more likely and or more severe in those cases. So those products, for example, an implantable defibrillator is considered a class 3. Class 1 would be your least likely to harm, and if harm occurs, least harmful consequences, say a stethoscope.
Sure.
And 2 is everything in between. But the point with regard to funding is, in order to have reimbursement through Medicare, Medicaid, and therefrom by insurance companies, those classifications and codes are an essential first step. Without that, without understanding that, we can't really understand what the reimbursement's like. Without reimbursement, many a great product has failed to get investment because it's just, if we can't rely on insurance companies to pay, we cannot be sure of commercial success, obviously.
And and this is just an aside because I know you need to finish answering the initial part of the question, but I'm just thinking about the levels 1, 2, 3, or 3, 2, 1, however you want to look at it. Do you have a greater chance of getting investors at one of those levels or another, or is it kind of equal depending on the product you're creating?
Wow, it's a really interesting question. So I'm going to use my professional judgment here, because I can't say that it's definitely one way or another. It really
of
depends.
course.
I'll tell you in my personal experience. So we look at different types of funding, and we're going to talk about this more momentarily, but we look at venture capital and angel investors, for example. And in my experience, the class 3 products, which are higher risk but potentially higher return,
right,
tend to be more appealing to the angel investor group because they're more mavericks, more of a loan. They'll have more likely have a loan investor, LONE, not LOAN.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas venture capitalists tend to be more equity based and just a horse of a different color. So that's just my personal experience. I'm sure we could find examples both ways.
Of course. I was curious if you had any personal experience with that. That perfectly answers the question. And I apologize for the interruption. But back to how to launch a product here in the United States and how that might differ from what we just heard you speak about when trying to launch a product in the EU.
Sure. So I'll start with the simplest differences. The documentation. So in the United States, we are required to maintain a design history file. I believe we're going to be discussing some of those documentation requirements in more depth shortly.
Right.
Design history file, which differs quite dramatically from the European documentation requirement, which is of a technical file or design dossier, although these are both being merged and modified into a different type of documentation with the new medical device regulation. These documents really start at the inception of the design concept and track its evolution, at least the design history file does in the United States. So it has to be started right at the beginning. So that's a big difference. Okay. Additionally, we've got the FDA's regulatory submission requirements. So for product classifications of 2 and 3, we have for product classification, for example, for class 3 product, we almost always, with some exceptions, require a pre-market approval or PMA submittal, which may include clinical trials. Some class 2 products also will go the PMA route and may include clinical trials. Okay. Class 1 products and most class 2 products will be a 510K process, which is much less burdensome, doesn't generally include clinical trials. And that is also called a pre-market notification. When we say that a product has FDA clearance, we're talking about the 510K approval process, less burdensome, less risky. We can only say that we have FDA approval for a product if we've submitted a PMA, pre-market approval application, and had it ratified. Now, I just want to add one detail. Some class 1 products are exempt from these types of filings altogether. So there are sort of variances as you go down the line from 3 to 2 to 1.
Which makes sense. I mean, obviously, the more risky or more damage it can cause to a patient, I would think the stricter they would be with some of these filings and regulatory requirements. So that does make sense to me. Staying with the regulatory theme for another moment, knowing how regulatory bodies classify your product can also have a significant impact on your schedule and the money. So why is this so important for investors to learn this early in the game?
Yeah, sure. Well, because, for example, if we stick with the Class 3 PMA, pre-market approval filing required in the U.S., we're looking at a long-term application process, particularly if we're required to gather human clinical trial data. You can imagine the additional time and cost involved in finding testing centers, developing protocols for the study, ensuring that they're in alignment with FDA's expectations. You look at the biostatistics that have to be run, for the data analysis, informed consent, IRBs within hospitals and testing centers, all manner of interim milestones where dosing is checked, safety and efficacy, and so on. And then it goes to FDA once we've gathered all of this for determination review, and that is itself an extensive process. Whereas a 510K type product, say a type Class 2 product, FDA attempts and does its best to give us a 90-day review period, although that can be extended for any number of reasons. And there is generally no clinical data required. It's a much less burdensome element. So the schedule and the investment are much, much less as well.
Okay. All right. That definitely makes sense. Thank you for the clarification on that. So as we continue to move towards marketability or commercialization of a product, we're building our business case. And not only do you need to show clinical need, which we talked about right at the beginning, but also outline the who's, the what's, the why's, similar to an old-fashioned business plan. Help us outline all that's necessary in this part of the process.
Sure. Oh, I love when we switch to the entrepreneur mode.
I know there's a lot of entrepreneurs out there, I'm sure, who are thinking some medical devices might be a great way or a great add to their portfolio. So I love this question too. I think it's an important piece of the process.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right, Stacey. And obviously, if you're an entrepreneur or joining a small startup company, which, these are very, very common in the biotech life science industry.
Of course.
It may be necessary for your listeners to create their own business plans for a new product. Although folks working in the larger organizations, depending on their role, generally don't get as involved. I'd love to explain what to do for those listeners who join the startups. So I typically advise a 5-year business plan. And the case itself will consider or include, I'm going to say, I made some notes there are about 6 items that I usually try to include. So if I may, I'll just quickly, broadly explain what they are. And then at the end of this podcast, perhaps we can give references to some additional reading material for those who want more detail. I know that's what you do each week.
We do. Yeah, we can include that right in the show notes.
Perfect. So just a high level, in the short time we have, the first step for the 5-year business plan or business case for devices would include determining first the market size, which that makes sense, doesn't it? That's a good place to start. What is the opportunity here? So when we determine the markets, when we say determine the market size, we're really looking at 4 key elements. The first is the unit volume. How many of these can we sell? Second, market penetration. Third, who are our key competitors, which of course informs 2 and 1. And then additionally, we'll look at local, regional, and global market penetration strategies, because we always hope to go in and grow regardless of where we initially launch.
Right.
The second item in our business case will be manufacturing assumptions. We'll want to document what our assumptions are, whether we, for example, are going to build this product in-house or we're going to contract it out to a contract manufacturer. And I'd like to just have your listeners bear in mind, if we build in-house, we're going to have an investment cost to, acquire or build the manufacturing line and to qualify it. We need to perform process validation, IQ, OQ, PQ, and calibration and maintenance and so on. However, we can then leverage that in-house capacity once we have it, potentially for extensions to the product line or even other products. So,
right. Okay. Yes. So I guess you would have to make that determination based on how many, product you think how long your process is going to be, or how long you're going to be able to manufacture in your facility versus, sending it out to a contract facility, correct?
Absolutely. And often, often we look at the burdensome initial costs involved in acquiring this equipment and say, gosh, I'm just going to farm this out. But I think that we need to also bear in mind the costs of partnership. So, and those are beyond just what we're, the amount that we're being invoiced from our contract manufacturer. This also includes regulatory requirements. In particular, they've been enhanced through those converging revised standards that I mentioned.
Right.
That in the US and in Europe and really worldwide for supplier control. So if we contract something out, there is a much more burdensome, again, that word, it's the word that just makes the most sense, fits the best. There's a much higher standard that we as the designers of the product are expected to uphold with regard to control of the quality of our partnerships. So the contract manufacturer is not responsible ultimately for the quality of the product. We are as the manufacturer.
Right. So there's no blame game going on here. If one of your vendors is not, compliant, I guess, then you as the device maker is not compliant, right? You can't pass the buck down the road. So I imagine then, part of managing risk is really making that comparison. I've got these vendors or these contract providers versus, being able to produce something in-house or build a manufacturing line. And that leads us actually into another question that I had for you about risk management planning.
Sure.
Which can streamline the product development process if considered in advance of actual product development. So you've talked about that a little bit. Compliance with risk management standards, people might think of ISO standards, if you will also have an impact on a company's perceived value. So what should be included in an initial risk management plan? I mean, especially knowing that we are looking for investors and looking for FDA approvals.
Absolutely. Well, there are some really significant changes in what is required with regard to risk management. So just to quickly remind your listeners, the recent revision in the ISO 14971 risk management standard, in the old days, we could get away with a couple of FMEAs, failure modes and effects analyses, and some very straightforward mitigation strategies, but no longer. Now, This is a fairly substantial investment and undertaking to comply with the risk management standard. And in fact, compliance with this risk management standard is a requirement to obtain the CE mark, which is a requirement for commercialization of medical devices in the European Union, all the member states. In addition, FDA has adopted the ISO 14971 for the United States. Not the most recent revision yet, however, the previous revision. So it is essentially the same, many, many ways. So this is a requirement for compliance. It's not only going to impact its perceived value, although that is certainly true, but it is in fact a requirement for compliance. So to answer your question, under the new standard, An initial risk management plan may include elements such as, first of all, it must be documented.
Okay.
We're expected to document the scope of the planned risk management activities. That includes identifying and describing the medical device and the life cycle phases for which each element of the plan is applicable. Is it only for a portion, or is it the entire life cycle? And then we need to document the overall responsibility for ensuring completion and approval of that plan. Then we've got to cover the risk management activities. And I'll just summarize briefly. They include risk analysis, risk evaluation, risk controls, residual risk, and risk benefit analysis, just to name a few. So the risk management plan is essentially just laying out what we intend to do throughout our very robust risk management system.
I appreciate you elaborating on that. So it's, obviously risk management is something that you have to take very seriously very early on in terms of planning, and not just reactive later on, once you have prototypes or other things happening. It requires a plan, and a very extensive one. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that in later episodes. But just to keep us moving on, I want to have enough time to speak about finding funding, because that is also a very important piece of getting your medical device to market. And no matter what industry you're in, securing funding can feel like, and sometimes is, a full-time job. Yeah. What key elements have you identified in streamlining that process?
Well, this is, as I said, this is really a fun question, because I am an entrepreneur and I have started a couple of businesses. So I'd love to share this with your listeners. I think we can all agree that, entrepreneurial pursuits and small business development is the engine of our economy. And this is really an exciting area. So to begin with, securing any kind of funding from any source always begins with a robust business plan. So the business plan that we were discussing previously,
right,
and that you'll have posted in the show notes, I think is essential. The more detailed, the more robust, the better. And so who you're going to target depends a little bit on what you're trying to do. Let me just give a couple of ideas to your listeners. First, we have the venture capitalists. I mentioned venture capitalists previously, along with angel investors, and these terms are often used interchangeably. I'm sure you've heard them, but they're not the same. So venture capitalists will essentially provide funding in exchange for an equity share in the company.
Okay.
All right. So their skin in the game is in the term of equity. Whereas an angel investor generally gives funding in exchange for convertible debt, although sometimes they'll look at an equity share as well, in addition to or instead of. But angel investors are different from venture capitalists also because they tend to be lone, as I said, LONE, maverick investors. Sometimes it'll just be a person who has the funds available and believes in your product. My experience is they tend to be more risk tolerant depending on that personality. Again, my experience is that venture capitalists, because they're looking at markets and they're a bit more formal and it's not just one maverick person usually, there tends to be more vetting and perhaps a little bit less risk tolerance, with exceptions. So those are two options. Crowdfunding. This is something we would not have included just a few years ago, but most of your listeners,
become wildly popular over the last maybe 6-8 years, right?
Absolutely. And I think we're all familiar with great examples of crowdfunding like Kickstarter. And just there are so many wonderful examples online, companies that were funded by Kickstarter and then were later sold to much larger companies, sometimes for billions of dollars. So definitely crowdfunding is a way to raise funds. In particular, I think we have an opportunity in the life sciences industry if we can make a strong case for how this will help our fellow man, and additionally, how it will drive advances in technology for the benefit of everyone. I mean, then we can always look at the old-fashioned items like taking a loan from your bank, usually the bank where you do your personal banking, it's more likely that they'll approve a loan, but you can always go to an online bank as well, dipping into your own savings or borrowing money from family or friends, or even bringing on a business partner who may be able to share not just in the funding, but also in some of the exposure or liability that's associated with a company like this.
Understood. Are there, in your experience, how do you choose, I guess, which avenue to pursue first, second, third? I mean, clearly, if you don't have the money in the bank, or a loan is just not accessible to you, then that might cross those off the list. But there's a lot of other options out there. So how do you really know which one is going to work best for your product?
Well, I immediately I go to a personal anecdote, if I may, with regard to my own experience. And I find that one of the most important questions an entrepreneur can ask herself is whether she has the personality, the temperament is the better word, for a business partner. That's the first one I would consider, and I would advise others to consider before even looking further. If you know that you're a person who really loves to put two heads together on every problem, maybe is a little bit gun shy about some of the liability that's involved, and really is really compatible with another set of skills that another person has. One of you brings 5 things and the other one brings 5 different things, and you work well together, then that might be a really good place to look, because as I say, it pays dividends in other ways. However, if you know that you perform best when you can make your own decisions, and that you don't want personalities or any of those sort of human elements to come in, then it's better. We have to know ourselves here. Most of the businesses that I've been on boards for,
right?
On the boards, we see that the majority of problems, and I'm just going to leave it at that generic term, problems, for confidentiality, have to do with partnerships. And so I would advise everyone that before they look there for funding, that they really take a long, hard look at what that might look like if and when it goes south. And in fact, we should never enter into a business partnership without having essentially an agreement about how we're going to dissolve that partnership before we ever need it.
Of course. So it sounds to me like it really doesn't matter what the product is that you're trying to put out there, what type of funding you receive. It sounds like it's more about the personalities involved and how you can collaborate on certain items and, push a project forward. And with that in mind, I'm just curious, before we wrap, I know we're running short on time for this particular episode, but I'm just wondering about trying to fund the medical device in its entirety versus maybe trying to gather funding for the first few phases or milestones. Can you relate that a little bit to what we've been talking about?
Absolutely.
Investors?
Sure, absolutely. And, in my experience, it's almost always best to look at funding in phases, because there are so many unknowns involved, Stacey. So, for example, are clinical trials required? And if so, we don't know until we do them, till we perform some number of them at least, what our likelihood of success is. Then you've got the big 3 would be clinical trials, regulatory submissions, and intellectual property. So depending on the outcome of those 3 milestones, I think we'll find most investors would prefer to have the opportunity, the right of first refusal, if you will, to reinvest or to invest additional funds if and when those milestones are met individually.
Understood. That makes perfect sense. Thank you. So we have covered a lot here in this first episode of planning, risk management planning, and funding. As we get ready to wrap up episode 1 and prepare for the next episode, which is going to focus more on the design, what last thoughts do you want to leave listeners with, Roberta?
Some of the best advice I received was it's never too early to begin building your network. But But I would like to challenge your listeners not just to build a network, but to curate a network. Don't build a network, curate a network. Look for specific individuals with complementary skills, perspectives, a diversity of experience. Some of it should complement yours. Some of it should be as different from yours as possible. Multiple backgrounds, diverse perspectives, and to make sure to offer these individuals something in return for their interest in your professional development and your product development, so that it's a win-win, so that you can come back and nurture those and use them again and again for the betterment of all parties involved.
I love it. For our listeners, again, curate your network. Don't just build it.
Yeah. Yes.
And Roberta, I'm going to pause. I'm going to stop there for this week. And we'd love to invite you back next week to speak on this topic more, and discuss really the design aspects more so. So thank you so much for being with us today. Also, thank you to my producer, Ed Sullivan, out there in Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe in your podcast player of choice, and don't forget to share with your friends and colleagues. That's how they learn about us, and it helps us grow. So you can find out more by visiting ivtnetwork.com, and tune in next week for another great episode, a continuing part 2 of this 3-part series with Roberta Goode, as we focus on getting your medical device to market in 10 easy steps. Until then, thank you and have a great day.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.